Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those joining from the United States. Welcome to this ESG talk. And we will be starting shortly. Just stay with us for a couple of minutes and we will start the webinar. Thank you.
David, my apologies. I'm on now.
Excellent. Welcome, Colin, and welcome, everyone. Let's get started. So I forgot which how many ESG talk we have organized already. I think this might be the 7th. As a reminder, the Candriam ESG Talk are part of Candriam's broader initiative through the Candriam Academy to provide free, high-quality ESG-related education content to the investment community. As a reminder, these talks are recorded, and you can ask questions to our panelists, which I will introduce shortly, by using the Zoom chat function. I will feed your questions to our panelists as we move along in the discussion. We are delighted to have with us today 4 fantastic individuals to discuss the latest development in US ESG regulation and ESG developments. And each of them brings a wealth of knowledge on how investors, companies, and regulators are shaping the United States transition to a cleaner, more efficient future. So let me introduce each of them. Alison O'Donnell is Vice President for Federal Government Affairs at New York Life. New York Life Insurance Company is the 3rd largest life insurance company in the United States and the largest mutual life insurance company, and is also Candriam's parent company. Jimmy Yan leads ESG and climate-related investment policy and initiatives in the New York City Comptroller's Bureau of Asset Management. The New York City Comptroller serves as a trustee, custodian, and investment advisors for the New York City pension funds, which have over $250 billion in asset under management. John Hodges is a member of BSR's global leadership team, BSR's executive for its New York office, and leads BSR's global infrastructure and financial services practices. In his work, he advises companies on corporate sustainability strategy, responsible investing, project development, as well as ESG risk management. Last but not least, Colin O'Mara serves as President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, America's largest wildlife conservation organization with 53 state and territorial affiliates and nearly 6 million members. He previously served as Secretary of Natural Resources and Environmental Control for the state of Delaware. I catch my breath. This is about as much as you will hear me talking today, I think. With such panelists, I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion. The purpose today is to bring you some valuable information about what has been happening within the United States, especially since the Biden administration entered the White House 6 months ago. A lot has happened. It is amazing to witness how fast the United States seems, and I say seems purposefully, maybe this is just an optical impression, seems to be moving towards greater sustainability, especially if you contrast this to the situation before January this year. So our panelists will share their experience in this transition as well as try at least to help us anticipate or imagine how the future over the next 1 to 2 years could look like regarding ESG within the United States. Let's get started. And Ali, I would like to start with you. You are our, if I may say so, our legal expert here. So my first question would be for you, what are the main regulatory bodies in the United States, and what have been their recent initiatives ESG-wise?
Well, thanks, David. Certainly, we've seen a lot of regulatory activity over the past several months. And part of the reason for this is that the Biden administration has been so focused on the role that capital markets can play in helping to address climate change. At a high level, I would say, these initiatives at the moment are really primarily focused on sort of disclosure and data. US regulators are just simply not as far along as Europe in their thinking. Second, I would say the initiatives are really leading with the E in ESG. They are principally at the moment climate focused. We do expect that they will get into the S and the G. Certainly, there's been a lot of interest in initiatives around diversity. So I would say that's probably a close second. Third sort of high level thing just to note is that many of these initiatives are really just in the early stages, and that they will take considerable time before they can be really fully finalized and implemented. In terms of the regulatory agencies that are sort of playing the largest roles, first and foremost is really the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. And the SEC has oversight over capital markets, over the asset management industry, and public companies. And they are certainly poised to play an outsized role. It's been a top priority of Chairman Gensler. I would say they're principally focused and sort of starting slow and kind of building and expanding from there. Right now, they're focused on a climate disclosure rule for public companies. Following that, we expect that then they'll move to climate disclosure rules for mutual funds and potentially credit rating agencies. From there, we think that they will expand their reach to look at things like diversity of mutual fund boards, and eventually could also consider rulemaking regarding public disclosure of political giving for public corporations. Beyond the SEC, there's a few other agencies that are worth monitoring. One is the Department of Labor, which sets the rules for retirement plans and how they can integrate ESG factors into their investment decision-making. That's a rule that will likely have considerable impact. Over the longer term, certainly would encourage folks to keep an eye on the Federal Reserve. The Fed moves very slowly and deliberately. Right now, they're really focused on making sure that they understand sort of the macro and the micro data before they move into any supervisory changes. But over the long term, we do think that the Federal Reserve could have a considerable impact in this space, given the sort of breadth and expanse of the financial institutions that they oversee. And then just finally, the Biden administration released an executive order a few weeks ago where they're directing federal agencies to take a complete look at all the financial risks associated with climate change. We're not sure exactly where this could go, but it could impact programs like Fannie and Freddie, which obviously play an outsized role in the mortgage-backed security market, looking at those climate risks. Could also get into things like procurement and contracting, but that's sort of on a longer time horizon.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ali. Colin, turning to you, we have the perception, maybe biased from this side of the Atlantic, that the change of administration has brought a dramatic shift towards more sustainable policies. Question to you is, has environmental policy in the United States become a black and white matter, depending on which party controls the White House and or the Congress, or is it more nuanced and it's just a media perception?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the markets are moving so quickly that the parties are following in some ways, and that I mean, in some ways, the Trump administration is a little bit of an aberration compared to the Republican Party as a whole. Now, I'm not going to pretend like there's not still kind of climate denialism within parts of the Republican Party, but at the leadership level, in terms of like the right committees and things like that, you see folks that want to see kind of bipartisan action. Now, there's a difference in opinion, right? I mean, you have a more regulatory, traditional kind of democratic approach. You have a more kind of markets-based, incentive-based, tax credits and the like, investments in innovation on the Republican side. But compared to 5 years ago, even or 10 years ago, where there was kind of a debate over whether kind of climate was a challenge that required government intervention. I mean, that's not really the debate right now. The debate's over solutions, which is a more healthy place for the U.S. conversation to be. So, you have Republicans talking a lot about carbon capture and talking about advanced nuclear and trying to figure out ways to clean up the fossil sector in ways that also kind of retain some level of extraction and production. On the Democratic side, you see a lot more focus on things like renewables and electric vehicles and kind of advanced transportation. But and I think there's also a growing realization that we kind of need all of it if we're going to meet our goals, given how far behind the eight ball we are. But I mean, I think every investor that cares about this space and sees the economic opportunities should be heartened by the progress in the bipartisan infrastructure package, where climate is, again, it's not enough, and we'll see more through kind of Democratic only pieces later. But huge investments. I mean, $100 billion of investments in advanced technology and in transit and in advanced energy technology and transmission. A lot of the kind of the key pieces we're going to need to kind of achieve the ambitious goals the president set. And so I think this has more staying power than kind of the whipsaw that I think investors have seen from administration to administration. Because if anything, I think as capital moves and kind of incentives are put in place, it's going to be harder to go back to the kind of the nightmare we saw the last 4 years.
Thanks. Maybe a trick question for you, based on what you just said. Would you say that we've reached a tipping point, meaning that whichever the next administration is in less than 4 years, what is being done now and started now cannot be undone, and is creating a momentum?
Like I think it's a two-part answer. I think investments really can't be undone, right? So if real capital moves, if tax credits are deployed, the kind of the unsung hero in a lot of the U.S.'s kind of evolution towards adopting clean energy was actually an $80 billion provision in the 2009 recovery package during the Great Recession. I mean, that probably did more to advance the kind of the cause of clean energy than anything on the regulatory side. Now, the challenge is just as the investments are more enduring, I think the regulatory side is more challenging, just given the conservative nature of U.S. courts, kind of the whipsaw we can see between administrations. And so, I would, if I was an investor, I'd be investing more on things that have that kind of congressional investment strategy as the underpinning for them, as opposed to a regulatory piece, which could get struck down by a circuit court or the Supreme Court, and it just has more risk. And I think that's it's a more dangerous thing to kind of rely all on. This is where the Obama administration second term agenda, which was entirely regulatory and didn't have much on the congressional kind of legislative side, it was obviously picked apart, not only by the courts but also by the Trump administration. We don't want to see history repeat itself again.
I keep in mind the fact that you might bring some interesting information later on. Which sector then would you say have the most momentum, no matter which administration comes next? But first, let's turn to Jimmy. Jimmy, what has been the role and the influence of the New York City Comptroller's Office in steering the U.S. towards stronger ESG standards? And how do you assess current initiatives mentioned by Ali and by Colin?
Well, we're certainly among those investors that are heartened by the shift in direction and momentum in the United States at the federal level. Although in the previous administration, we did not let that sway our conviction in sustainable investing and consideration of climate change. We did not see any changes in policies and laws as fundamentally changing our fiduciary duty and what we're allowed and obligated to do. We've been pushing for full steam for a very long time. And I think I would speak for a lot of our peer asset owners and public pension funds in terms of that mindset. And over time, certainly we've engaged in some policy advocacy, submitted comments to the SEC or testimony to Congress. It's not a daily activity of ours, but we certainly do some of that. And we recently submitted comments in response to the the SEC request for comments on climate disclosure. We certainly think we share a lot of the same priorities as a lot of our peers in saying that climate change disclosures need to be mandatory, and we particularly highlighted the 10 disclosure indicators of the Climate Action 100 Plus Net Zero Company benchmark as disclosures that we think the SEC should require. This includes things like Scope 1 and Scope 2, and then Scope 3 emissions where applicable, whether the company set a net zero goal, emissions reduction targets, capital allocation alignment with their targets and goals, alignment of companies' climate-related public policy advocacy with net zero goals, use of scenario analysis, impact on employees, human capital is very important to us, geographic location, facilities and supply chain as examples. And other than that, we've tried to we work collaboratively with industry organizations and coalitions to further develop and advance ESG standards. Organizations that most of you probably know about, Council of Institutional Investors, Ceres, PRI, and participate in all of their advocacy activities as well.
Yeah, certainly we know you as an active member of some of these coalitions, and that started way before this year. John, I turn to you as someone who is very much attuned to the thinking of S&P CEOs and sustainability officers. In your view, how is corporate America responding to the renewed push by US regulators towards sustainability? And beyond the headlines around net zero and stakeholder capitalism following the Business Roundtable's announcement 2 years ago, are companies, in your view, generally embracing sustainability?
I think it, first of all, depends upon the company. It's been interesting to hear Ali and Colin and Jimmy already kind of give their perspectives, because, if you were trying to maybe give a quick snapshot summary of what's happening in the US, I would say it's, ESG progress. Things are generally going in the right way and have accelerated in the last couple of years when it comes to corporate action. Has that been because the pandemic has created kind of a new awakening, or some of the social unrest we had in the US last summer? Has it been because of the Trump administration and the pushback that came with that on ESG regulations and now the election of Biden? Maybe. I think a lot of it has to do with corporations, they're based in the US, seeing what's happening globally, seeing what's happening particularly in Europe, but also in Australia and other places, seeing what's happening in states in the US and some of the initiatives that are taking place there, like in California, and realizing that this is the future and they're global companies. And so whether the US regulatory environment is first or last, they'll see this as a movement that they will have no choice but to participate in. Now, having said that, yes, there's a lot of corporate action on ESG because of compliance, or particularly pre-compliance, the belief that regulation is yet to come. They see, Jimmy and organizations like that advocating for regulatory change. But I think a lot of it also has to do with pressure from other stakeholders, not just investors, from employees. If you're in a B2B type of business market, you'll see that your main customers are asking you for ESG data information, but also performance, improving your ESG performance. Also, I think there's a growing number of corporations in the US that simply think that good ESG performance is good for business. And we've always wanted to say that and believe that, and I'm not sure it's always been true, but I think it is increasing. And what we see is kind of an interesting movement here in the US, where you have some corporations, particularly CEOs, some may be well known, that are advocating for regulation, advocating for, let's say, a carbon tax or cap and trade. So much so that the Republican Party is pushing back and saying, we don't want to hear from these corporate advocates, these activist CEOs anymore. It's kind of ironic that you have someone like a Jamie Dimon, now the Republican is saying is too liberal when it comes to ESG. So I think that's been a very interesting dynamic that's happened the last year or so as well. So I personally believe that it's a mixture. It's a big salad of efforts. but you cannot discount corporations actually leading the agenda for many different reasons. Like I mentioned, stakeholder, business opportunity, business value creation, and also the pressure they're feeling in their overseas markets.
You mentioned California and Jimmy, of course, here bringing the New York perspective. All that shows that there is what's happening at the federal level, and then there is the states level. From our side of the Atlantic, we often undervalue what's happening at the state level, and sometimes it can go in concert or against what's happening at the federal level. So Ali, turning to you, how have US states responded to the White House push towards greater sustainability, climate, diversity, and so on?
Well, it's a great question. We have 50 states that have 50 different views when it comes to ESG. So we've really seen a big divergence. There's always sort of been the Californias of the world that have been very active in this space. States have sort of taken further steps. Maine just announced that it will divest of all oil and gas investments by 2026. On the other side of the coin, we have states like Texas that recently passed legislation barring all state and local governments from doing any business with firms that discriminate against the oil and gas industry and the firearms industry. That is their view. That is the view of the state, and they're really trying to sort of leverage their market power here behind their values. I think it's not clear completely what the impact will be of this legislation, but certainly there are a lot of other states that will follow their lead and will consider policies in this space. And so it's a trend that's really worth monitoring, seeing what impact this has. Do you have different pension plans taking very different views and approaches to this? Are they able to sort of continue with whatever policies they might have established prior to this legislation or these policies being enacted? But it is a question, and it is something that we will continue to see play out over the coming months and years.
Thanks, Ali. Does anyone want to add anything to this states versus federal question?
Yeah, I would add one note, and Ali knows much more about this than I do, but for those who are not, from the United States, may not be familiar, that we actually have something called Renewable Portfolio Standards, RPS. Something like 35 or 40 states, Ali, I believe, have a renewable energy target. And some of these are very ambitious. It's 50% renewable energy production in the state by 2035, 2040. That's been increasing. And some of those are what we call, our red states, ones controlled by the Republican Party on the state legislator level. Even Texas has a standard, what is a certain amount of renewable energy production. I'm from Texas originally, and although you'll hear a lot of oil and gas mindset coming out of Texas, it's the largest producer by far of wind energy in the United States, and they have a goal for producing a certain amount of renewable energy in Texas, and they're on target to meet those goals. So that's something that's been in place for a long time, decades now. And it's been pretty successful so far.
Thanks, John. Well, you brought the topic of renewables and power generation in general. So we know that the US is back to the climate negotiation table and has set itself a very ambitious target to cut emissions by 50% compared to 2005 level by 2030. Knowing that the first 18% cut, so where we are today compared to 2005 level, we are already at minus 18%, 1/8, were cut thanks mostly to the switch from thermal coal to natural gas. Something that maybe not many people realize is that had little to do with switch to renewable, and mostly economics that made coal less competitive than natural gas, and also some outsourcing of manufacturing activities to China. Colin, maybe first you, but then others can chip in as well. What needs to happen for the US? And I know it's a very, very big question, and we'll only be able to give a short answer for the US to hit that 2030 50% reduction target.
No, I appreciate the question. And I mean, the Biden administration's, kind of doubling down on the 60% of emissions that are coming from the power sector and the transportation sector. I mean, the big push we're seeing around like electrification of transportation. I mean, obviously a huge focus of an area that the U.S. has been lagging in compared to some other parts of the world. Really doubling down on the clean energy, and you'll see the clean energy piece move on two fronts. One is through just really aggressive incentives for everything from solar and wind and geothermal to a whole bunch of things around storage and batteries, and really trying to build out the system as well as transmission, as well as standards. And I think the debate over the kind of so-called clean energy standard, this idea of having kind of requirements for what the mix should be, kind of performance-based over time, and how that fits into our very archaic kind of legislative rules is a kind of complicated thing that I'm deep in the middle of right now. But I mean, I think those are the two major pieces. I mean, we're pushing hard from the National Wildlife Federation's point of view, just to make sure we're also making the deep investments in agriculture and in natural climate solutions in the industrial sector, which obviously some of the toughest emissions to reduce, and kind of those next generation technologies that, although they may not be critical to the 2030 goal of getting to 50% or 52%, are going to be critical to getting to a net zero in the decades ahead. And so things like advanced carbon capture and hydrogen and even direct air capture potentially. And also just not forgetting that the natural pieces are often cheaper. So there's a lot of opportunities in the US for forestry, grasslands, wetlands to be a sink as we're trying to buffer some of the challenges ahead. But I mean, I think you're going to see, and this gets back to your question earlier about kind of opportunities for investment. I mean, the power sector is crowded. The transportation sector is less crowded. And I mean, I think there's lots of opportunities for innovation and kind of getting value out of entities that just haven't had the same level of attention. I mean, solar is going to become a commodity, right? I mean, like these different technologies are going to have, kind of price kind of depression. And I'd like to see more of it made here. Obviously, there's a lot of different pieces. I mean, the Made in America piece, especially in the context of China, is going to become a bigger and bigger part of the U.S. debate. And you see a lot of activity around that from folks like Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia and others that just want to have, make sure we're not just outsourcing our technology that are in many cases innovated or at least worked on here, but then produced overseas. But I think that's where I'd keep my focus for the 2030 goals is power and transportation.
And within transportation, obviously, this is a broad sector. It's not just about building electric vehicles, but also the whole charging infrastructure needed for all these vehicles to be recharged, right?
Yeah, exactly. And look, I mean, and I think unfortunately in the US context, a lot of the conversation between the power sector and the transportation sector have been a little divorced, which is a little crazy given we're talking about electrifying at least the small passenger and kind of mid-sized vehicles. You may need liquid fuels for some of the bigger, kind of transport pieces. But, I mean, that additional load, right, is massive. And right now, it's still more likely to be met with additional gas in some cases, natural gas, than it is to be met with renewables. We also have a huge problem in the U.S. Around nuclear plants that were built in the 60s and 70s that in some cases are coming down, taking out huge amounts of kind of carbon-free power out of the system and being replaced by gas. And so it's just another thing I keep an eye on, because there's going to be a big push to try to keep some of those units running, but we're going to have to bring more clean energy online. Otherwise, we're going to be locking ourselves into technologies that are cleaner. I mean, gas is going to cleaner, and you can debate about the life cycle emissions, but at the end of the day, that's not kind of where we need to be right now, as we're bringing a lot more electrical demand online.
This is a debate we are very familiar with in the Europe as well. Jimmy, you've been witnessing all that, and as an investor, you have obviously a big role to play in supporting that transition. So how do you integrate ESG and in particular climate change consideration within your investment decision? And is your approach, you think, representative for a typical US institutional investors? I have my idea about the answer here. Or I think you have been pretty much leading the pack?
Yeah, thank you for that. I like to think that we're in the sort of the leading quadrant of the pack, at least. But I'll say that there are two general areas where we integrate ESG and climate into our investment decisions. First, we integrate those into our due diligence of all investment decisions across all asset classes and strategies. And second, we recently established a goal to double our investments in climate change solutions across the portfolio, specifically to increase our investments in such assets from around 1% to 2% or $2 billion to $4 billion across our portfolio. So just first about the broader ESG and climate integration, we're 100% externally managed. So it's critical to integrate ESG into our manager selection evaluation processes. We have a significant set of ESG and climate questions that are incorporated into our due diligence questionnaires for all asset classes. We first integrated ESG questions into our due diligence around 2007 initiative I was actually involved in when I served as a trustee for one of the pension funds. Since then, the questions have evolved, but the core has remained the same. What our investment staff focus on is the policies and processes that managers have around ESG and climate, what their approach is for assessing the materiality of ESG, and how ESG is integrated into their investment decisions, and how differentiated their insights into ESG and climate are. In addition to climate, an important part of our ESG diligence is diversity and inclusion. That's an important issue for many of our trustees. In 2015, as an initiative of Controller Stringer, we integrated a new set of questions related to diversity and inclusion into our diligence for all managers. And we believe we might have been the first large asset owner to do this in such a comprehensive way. In these questions, we ask managers about their policies and practices to foster diversity in their workplace, including how they ensure accountability. And we also ask for information related to the race, ethnicity, and gender of the manager's investment professionals. Our CIO at the time was a huge proponent of this policy because of the fiduciary grounding of it in empirical research that demonstrates the correlation between diverse decision-making and strong economic performance. So since then, ILPA, which is the Industry Association for Limited Partners in Private Equity, created an expansive diversity section in their due diligence template, which we gave input on. And now we use that ILPA due diligence template for diversity in our work. We also incorporate sections on ESG and diversity in all of our investment memos to our investment committee and our trustees. And then in regards to our climate solutions goal, where we're doubling our investments in climate solutions, we announced that in 2018, saying that we wanted to achieve that by the end of this year. We're very happy that we were able to surpass the goal, that goal earlier this year, and we're still sourcing potential investments. The goal is to prudently increase our investments in climate solutions, which we define generally as renewable energy, energy efficiency, climate mitigation, adaptation, natural resources, and similar activities. This means that we're seeking thematic strategies focused on climate in all asset classes, but we're also looking at non-climate themed strategies, such as diversified strategies and products that might invest in more climate solutions. So it's not limited to climate thematic strategies. Although we were able to surpass our goal ahead of schedule, it was still challenging. All of our investments, of course, are subject to our fiduciary duty, which means we do not compromise our standards or performance for this goal. In public markets, for example, we recently concluded a public equity and fixed income search related to climate solutions. We focus on key areas that include, but are not limited to, repeatable investment process, track record with performance attributions, strength of the team, risk management, which we're interested in given the at least some of the focus concentration on climate solutions products and other areas. And we because the focus is on climate, we look at how managers evaluate climate as a driver of performance and a risk factor.
Thanks, Jimmy. I'll get back to you later to ask about how you then measure the performance and the climate and environmental and ESG performance of these investments. But before that, to you, John, we have talked about infrastructure in the context of power generation, utilities, transportation. And I believe you have, but you are still very much involved in infrastructure investments. So could you share with us your take on the infrastructure plan announced by the White House, whether you think this is going in the right direction, and if not, what needs to be done and could be done?
Yeah, well, first of all, we're kind of in the middle of the political mess, the giant plate of spaghetti that the food fight that will exist over the next, foreseeable future about exactly what the infrastructure bill will be and which bill it will be and all of that. I don't know, Ali, if you have a winner, but I generally am looking towards the bipartisan bill, the one that was announced a few weeks ago amongst a group of senators, is the most likely outcome. That may have been what Colin was referring to earlier when he was giving some of his thoughts on it. And what I see in this bill is a lot of good. Agreeing with Colin as well. Large scale investment. There's a goal around 500,000 EV charging stations. There's a lot of investment in climate resilience and so forth. But a lot of the bill is just fixing things that should have been fixed 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's a lot to do with the quality of our pipe systems for water and sanitation and things of that nature, and bridge. We've had some very tragic and very kind of well documented and publicized events with bridge collapses and things of that nature in the US. And so reinforcing that type of infrastructure that should have been repaired and hasn't been maintained because we've been underfunding it for so long. So that's good, that's important, that should be done. The other side of the equation, though, which doesn't get me excited, is the lack of kind of innovation that's there. So I focus a lot of my attention. We have a futures lab at BSR. I focus a lot of my attention on the future of transport. I've written some articles about this. What does that look like? And I remember from my time being, I was a World Bank infrastructure economist for about a decade, a lot of developing non-OECD countries I worked in were just skipping generations of infrastructure. They weren't putting in, the wiring for old telecommunication systems. They were going straight to cellular. They're going straight to fiber optics and so forth. And I look at the United States as a place right now, there's an opportunity to skip that generation of infrastructure. So there's a lot of investment in rail and public transport, but it's going to basically be upgrades of the current system, in my mind, where we should be looking at things like Hyperloop technology and skipping the high-speed passenger rail that exists currently in Europe and going to the completely next iteration of what that would look like. So I like to see not just improvement on existing infrastructure and with some slight upgrades and the newest technology. I like to think about really how can we redesign with the sustainability mindset, but redesign our infrastructure systems to have them much more 21st century and not just 20th century.
So you're very much a partisan of a kind of moonshot mentality instead of trying to iterate on existing technology. It's what you're saying, right?
And this is not a coincidence, but a lot of those moonshot technologies I mentioned, Hyperloop, are much more energy efficient. They're designed to be built with renewable energy sources embedded in them. And so there's a way of thinking about this, not just, is it quicker, faster, cheaper, safer? Is it actually better for the environment at the same time? And building that in from the very beginning in the early stages. That would be my hope, and the private sector would be taking a leading role in this. It doesn't all have to be public funding. There's a big fight in the US about how much this will cost and how we pay for it. But the private sector, they'll want to invest in those new technologies. I mean, Jimmy knows this much better than I, but those are great investment opportunities.
Yeah, well, I think Colin mentioned some other examples when he briefly touched upon direct air capture. So meaning capturing CO2 straight from the air rather than out of an industrial process where it's already generated as pure CO2. So Colin, just a question for you. I had the impression when you were talking that the 50% target was almost like too easy, and we should already focus on the next step, which relates to the moonshot John just mentioned about how we then continue decarbonizing towards net zero beyond 2030. So am I right? Do you think that the US is already on the right trajectory, for example, to decarbonize the transportation sector, which, as a reminder to everyone, the US is the largest consumer of oil, and most of it goes into transportation.
Yeah, no, I don't. If I gave that impression, I apologize. I mean, I think it's a big lift. I think the pieces. I think we have the right leadership in place. I think we have the right proposals on thing. But to John's point, I mean, the bipartisan package alone is insufficient to get where we need to get to 30%, 50% by 2030. And I agree with John. I think that there's a lot of money on the energy innovation side around like carbon capture technologies and kind of different advanced technologies. There's almost nothing on the advanced transportation side. There's a little bit in the battery piece, and obviously transmission and innovation is going to help. as we're electrifying. But in terms of like the next generation, I mean, a lot of it's like repairing, Amtrak or public rail systems from the from the 1950s, as opposed to thinking about 2050 and keeping up with our friends in Asia, or even Central Europe. And so, I mean, I think I don't think it's easy by any sense. I mean, to be completely honest, I mean, I don't think we can go into Glasgow with a straight face and say we're going to be able to achieve our 2030 goals unless a significant, robust infrastructure package is passed at that point, because the regulatory underpinnings to get to that level of reduction, and having those actually be sustainable across multiple administrations through the 2030 timeframe, I think is tenuous. And so, I mean, I think that's what I'd be looking at. And the bipartisan piece is likely going to pass. I think there will be some pieces that are kind of added to afterwards. I'm actually pretty optimistic, because I think you've kind of the right players and having the right conversations right now. And I was on the Hill yesterday, and I testified about the bipartisan package, the energy pieces of it, about 2 weeks ago. And there's a lot of good in a committee that can get a little acrimonious at times. I mean, there's a lot of camaraderie around these different pieces. But I just think it's a transformational shift to get to 50%. But I think it's achievable in a way that it probably wasn't even 5 years ago.
Thanks, Colin. Everyone has been mentioning regulation. So I turn back to you again, Ali, as our regulation expert. What can we expect? And of course, this is just a prediction out of your crystal ball. What can we expect over the next 12 months from the US regulators? And for example, is the SEC going to create a US version of SFDR, something we know all too well on this side of the Atlantic? Or on the contrary, will the US adopt a more focused approach to ESG, starting with climate and maybe also diversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. David, I did just want to comment, just to build on what John and Colin mentioned, just one point on the bipartisan infrastructure package. One piece that I do think is worth folks paying attention to are some of the infrastructure financing provisions. There's an effort to bring back direct payment bonds, very similar to the Build America Bond program. Also a new infrastructure financing authority. These are really important tools. We fund infrastructure very differently in the US than Europe does. And so just something to think about as state and local governments try to figure out how they can access capital in a more meaningful way. These are tools that I think could have a real impact in helping move towards sustainability. But to answer your question about the regulatory
Ali,
environment, I think we're going to continue to.
Can you just, you mentioned something now, but I feel like I want to know more about it now. It's too much teasing. What are these Build America bonds, and how do they differ from straight bonds or treasuries?
Yeah, so great question. So a direct payment bond is a taxable bond. It has this, you're sort of investing in very similar projects that you would with a tax exempt bond, public infrastructure projects. These bonds generally have a longer duration, maybe a 10 to 30 year duration. They fund projects that maybe aren't funded through shorter duration bonds in the muni market. The appetite and interest in these bonds back in the 2009 and in 2010 period was largely from institutional investors, insurance companies, pension funds, foundations, a number of international investors were really interested in the underlying investment in infrastructure, but don't see the benefits of the tax exemption that has really been like a hallmark of the tax exempt municipal market. There's been a lot of appetite and interest in this area since 2010, when the program ended, I think some would say prematurely. And there's been a significant interest in bringing it back. And really this would provide state and local governments with access to a whole new set of investors that most have not really had access to. Okay,
thanks. Now about the main question, what's going to happen in the next 12 months?
Yes, I think we'll see a slow and steady approach. Think of this as sort of building blocks. If you think about just the SEC looking at climate disclosure for public companies, and then climate disclosure and ESG disclosure for mutual funds, ratings agencies, then they'll probably start looking more closely at things like diversity and potentially political spending. But think about this as sort of a building block. There's big questions that the SEC has to resolve around things like materiality and what information is material and what is not. And so I think they will approach it slowly. As Colin made reference to, some of the potential for challenges in the courts and the fact that some of these regulations may not be as stable as some might like. I think the SEC is going to try to approach this slowly to try to prevent that to the maximum extent that might be possible.
Okay, well, it sounds like nothing is done yet, and there's a lot of announcements, but nothing set in stone. And maybe as a follow-up, I mentioned SFDR. There are initiatives now, and people talk about the acronym SOUP when referring to ESG these days, with TCFD and the like. So do you have any view on the potential for the US to lead the creation of global standards around, for example, IFRS for corporate disclosure, or SASB, which has already been in place for a few years now?
So I think that's sort of a question that still remains to be seen. I think there is clearly an interest from the corporate community, and capital markets are global. They're not just domestic. So there is an interest in leveraging these standards that already exist, that some firms may already be complying with. But how they're all leveraged and integrated, I think that's a really big question that has not yet been resolved in the US.
Okay, thanks, Ali. I turn to you, John, with a little similar question. So between climate change integration, the potential through military TCFD to push for further disclosures by corporate, something that the G7, for example, has come out very, very strongly in favor. ESG data transparency with the global standard. I just mentioned SASB and IFRS. Diversity consideration as a follow-up to Black Lives Matter. In your view, which ESG dimension, maybe another one that I haven't mentioned, is the most pressing for corporates to consider? I guess these guys are confronted with a number of people coming at them with a request for data, for taking side, and now more than ever, it's standing still is becoming very hard to defend.
Yeah. Before I jump to that question, on Ali's point, she says the biggest question about what's going to happen. I think it's the biggest challenge. Corporate investors, they're not just kind of moving forward themselves and want to see this happen. They're kind of screaming it for it to happen. They want standardization, consolidation. It's a complete mess right now. It's too much to follow, the acronym SOUP. And I think all the participants really would love to see government make some decisions. So maybe that will eventually accumulate in some type of standardization. Back to your question, I'm going to answer your question and not answer your question. Mostly not answer your question. That's okay.
I kind of saw that coming.
because I can't. When the pandemic started, I thought, here we go. Corporations are going to consolidate and focus their attention and resources around community and employee health and safety. And that's going to be the dominant issue for the next 3 to 5 years. And then with the social issues that came about, the Black Lives Matter and so forth in the US last summer, I said, this is going to be, you're going to see some dimensions being added on, but it's going to be really about social justice. And are we as a society and employers actually taking care of our people properly? But to my surprise, that is not what's been happening. While those issues have increased in importance, and focus for corporations on their ESG programs and their direction and so forth, their strategies, it's been really broad-based. BSR does a tremendous amount of materiality work each year for large corporations. And there is still significant and increasing attention towards climate and human rights and biodiversity and a whole host of issues. So the overall agenda is increasing. and it's not really consolidating around a few areas. I mean, Jimmy rattled off quite a few things that they track themselves. I'm sure there's a lot that he'd even have on his list or didn't mention. What I do think is one thing that is interesting is that, again, for those who may not be as focused on the US and the way things work here, there's a lot of activity, and there has been for a while, around investors putting forward resolutions to companies for votes, for shareholder votes around ESG. And we saw the articles recently with the Exxon vote and the changing of some of the board members there. But this has been going on for a long time. It kind of spotlights certain companies or specific issues at one given time. I think there is a continuing growing trend around that topic, and particularly more around the investor questions of companies around how they're participating in the political process. So those aren't familiar, there's something called the Cpa Ziklin Index. It gives transparency scores for how companies engage in lobbying and associations they work with and so forth. There's a lot more resolutions. There has been for a long time. It's been a big part of the ESG resolution field, but there's a lot of resolutions coming forward on that. And so when companies call us and need help, a lot of calls I've gotten recently have been, we have pressure from an investor or stakeholder about how we're engaging in the political process. And that was true during the Trump administration. You know, are you going along with some of the things we may not like the Trump administration is doing, but also true of the Biden administration, how strongly you're advocating for and being part of that solution as well. So I think, you know, given our political dynamics in the US and given how a long history of corporations being very active in the political process, a lot of money is given, you know, to candidates and associations for certain political policies. I think that's only going to increase over the next 3 to 5 years. And you may see some standards, not just new transparency, but some standards come around that as well, or at least expectations at minimum of companies. I don't think they can hide in the shadows anymore and say on their website, climate change is a major problem. We have a target. We're really doing our best to do our part on climate change and mitigate our emissions. But then being a member of an association over here that's in DC lobbying against any climate legislation. You can't do that anymore in the United States. It just won't work.
So you think the Exxon case might serve as a wake-up call for corporate America that investors are getting serious about companies putting their money where their mouth is, or in that case,
so, you know, accumulation. You have these votes, and they get 5% the first year, then 10%, and usually the company will engage with whoever puts the resolution forward and says, okay, let's find a solution, and you'll withdraw it hopefully. But the companies that have fought it for years and said, we can always outvote this. I think that was a bit of a wake-up call. I think there's just a certain amount of recognition that companies, and Allie's an expert in this, she does this for a living, they have a large network of their government affairs work, partnerships, associations, advocacy groups, all sorts of different elements to it. And there needs to be consistency across that. They need to be speaking with one consistent voice in what they stand for and what they stand against.
Thanks, John. Jimmy, going back to you with the question that could really help us get even more tangible about how companies can really deliver on these environmental, social front. And from your perspective, I guess the question is, how do you measure companies' progress across all the potentially conflicting objectives they could have, and across the asset classes you invest in? You invest across a broad range of asset classes. Do you actually manage to find metrics allowing you to assess companies' performance, and where do you see the challenges and opportunities there?
I think that is the most developed probably with our corporate governance team, which is technically separate from I collaborate with them a lot. They're headed by Michael Garland, who's run a tremendous leader in corporate governance for many years. But I think with metrics, I think it goes to the larger question of how we focus on the social environmental impacts of our investments, and how we measure these impacts. Historically, we haven't regarded ourselves as an quote unquote impact investor, since that entails investing with the primary purpose of having a positive social environmental impact. Our exclusive fiduciary purpose is to achieve a strong risk-adjusted return for our over 700,000 beneficiaries. But you can't separate social and environmental impacts from financial performance in many cases, which is why we consider the materiality of ESG in our investment decisions. So the focus on impact is evolving and growing in the investment industry and among our peers, along with the growing recognition of the systemic risks and opportunities that are posed by ESG factors, especially climate and social equity related issues. So these issues are appropriately entering the calculus of fiduciary duty, and this does lead to more efforts to measure impact. We're still evolving on this front. I think we have a long ways to go and have delved into impact metrics, mostly in the area of climate and diversity thus far. We're conducting an updated carbon footprint analysis this year, for example. That is especially important as the world embraces net zero commitments increasingly. And as I mentioned before, we assess the diversity metrics of our asset managers and are strengthening this now by establishing a more systematic assessment of diversity, equity, inclusion characteristics of our managers with a sort of more rigorous approach. So this is definitely something that I personally project we'll be doing more of, and our peers will be doing more of in the years to come.
Thanks, Jimmy. And I can understand why you start with measuring the carbon footprint across our investment, since this is probably the area where you can get the most reliable and widespread data, right? Yeah.
Yes.
This is exactly also a finding from this side of the Atlantic. Just a last question, unless anyone wanted to add something to what Jimmy said. Otherwise, I have just a clarification question for Ali around the Department of Labor. It's been mentioned several times, fiduciary duty. If I'm not mistaken, until earlier this year, it was forbidden for an investor to consider ESG as part of his fiduciary duty. So that applied to pension funds, right? And how have things evolved on that front? Because this could have also an impact for pension funds wanting to consider ESG, right?
That's exactly right. So in President Biden's executive order, he directed the Department of Labor to basically review and largely rescind the Trump administration's rulemaking here, which was roundly opposed by many investors, many in the financial services industry. So the Department of Labor is revamping that. Their goal is to make it clear that pension funds and other retirement plans can consider ESG factors in their investment decision making. It's an important rule that really needs to be corrected. It's a very high priority of the Department of Labor. We expect that we may see a proposed rule as soon as September in this space, but we do expect it to be sort of finalized in relatively short order because this is such a top priority for this administration.
Thanks, Ali.
If I could chime in on that briefly,
Sure.
Definitely that the Department of Labor guidance under the Trump administration was wrong and poorly written and a detriment to ESG investing. But my view, I think a lot of folks' view is that it didn't fundamentally change legal requirements under ERISA. And there's a lot of discouraging language that casts more doubt on, and I'm a lawyer by background, casts more doubt on what you can do, and certainly I believe has had a chilling effect on many who maybe are newer to ESG related investing. But I think despite the Trump administration's best efforts, I don't think their guidance actually changed the law. It's actually only guidance, but it was certainly it certainly raised a lot of questions. And every presidential administration has changed the DOL guidance back and forth. I think a lot of other lawyers don't think that those changes in language fundamentally changed fiduciary law requirements. Also, our pension fund is not directly governed by ERISA. although we follow, standards that are similar to RESO. So that guidance didn't directly apply to us.
Thanks, Jimmy, for the clarification. We've reached the end of the allocated time. Does anyone would like to add a final word?
I'll just add one last thing. I mean, I would
Sure.
just encourage, investors abroad to the US is back. Like, we're in the conversation, we're in it in a serious way. Like, things are moving quickly right now, and there's a lot of opportunity. So I would just encourage folks to kind of put the US back in the kind of the top of the list of places to consider. I'd particularly think about the transportation sector. I'd particularly think about some of the more innovative technologies that John's talked about, things that are a little undercapitalized right now that could have big returns. But that's finally we have leadership, and we're back at the international tables. And if we do well the next few months, I think Glasgow could be a huge success. So, David, thanks for having me.
I couldn't think about better words to conclude this webinar. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Ali, John, Jimmy, for sharing your views. It was extremely useful, interesting to listen to you. Thanks to our audience. There will be a replay available of this webinar sent within the next couple of days. Until next time, goodbye.